Levi Brackman here with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Torah portion, uncensored series in the podcast. Today we're talking about the parasha of Re'eh, that is the book of Deuteronomy. Now what we're going to discuss today is prophets, and how can one tell if we have a false prophet? This to me is a very vexing problem, because within religion, it is very easy for people to fool other people and tell them that they have a connection with God and therefore they somehow have access to the truth and you should listen to what they have to say because they have access to the truth. I think that religions of all types are littered with false prophets, littered with people who claim to have certain insights, certain abilities to communicate with something otherworldly, but in fact it turns out that they do not have that ability at all, and they're proven to be false prophets of one type or another. Now, let's assume for a moment that there is such a thing as true prophets. How can one tell whether the prophet is a true prophet or a false prophet? Well, the Torah portion that we are talking about today tells us how to discern between a true prophet and a false prophet, and we're going to discuss that in detail today and talk about some modern day ramifications of this. So let's jump right in. Deuteronomy chapter 13 starts off saying, "Everything I command you, that you shall be careful to do it. Neither shall you add to it nor subtract to it." And then it says, "If there will arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of a dream, and he gives you a sign or a wonder." So he does miracles, this person. "And the sign or the wonder of which he spoke to you happens." So he says this and this thing's going to happen, and he gives a sign about it, and that thing actually occurs. And then he says, "Let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us worship them." Says the Torah, "You shall not heed the words of that prophet or that dreamer of a dream. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you really love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall follow the Lord your God, fear him, keep his commandments, heed his voice, worship him, and cleave to him." So, number one, the first thing you need to know is that if this prophet acts like a prophet, he does signs, and he actually says something's going to happen, and in fact happens, but he tells you to follow other gods, then that is a false prophet. Then it continues, verse 6, "And that prophet or that dreamer of a dream shall be put to death, because he spoke falsehood about the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and who redeemed you from the house of bondage, to lead you astray from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to go. So shall you clear away the evil from your midst." So the idea here seems to be clear, and that is that if you have a prophet, seems to be a real prophet, but he tells you to do something other than what Moses told them to do, to go and follow another god, which Moses didn't tell them about, well, then you know it's a false prophet, even if what the prophet prophesies actually happens and comes to pass. Now, what is a prophet? Maimonides, in the Guide to Perplexed, book 2, chapters 38, 39, and 40, etc., talk about prophecy. And in chapter 38, he talks about the two faculties that are needed for prophecy. Number one is courage, and the second one is divination. And the idea is that every person has within them, to varying degrees, courage and divination. Divination he describes as this ability to somehow be able to say what might happen in the future, and then it either occurs or it doesn't. The more one has the faculty of divination, the more it's likely that that thing occurs. And he says that the way this happens is through the imagination. That a person has an imagination, and when they have an overflow from the active intellect, if you like, from God into their imagination, that then also impacts their own intellect, and therefore they're able to comprehend things that they wouldn't be able to comprehend otherwise. And the more they're in touch with the active intellect, with the divine, the more they have this overflow, which is then able to give them this kind of insight that allows them to see the future and to be able to say things that they wouldn't otherwise know. Different than people who don't have this connection to the active intellect and just have imaginations. They just imagine things which actually could never occur, or just dreamers, people who dream things. Your dreams don't mean anything necessarily, but if you are a person who has this overflow from the active intellect, from God, into your imagination and then into your actual intellect, and you're able to cognize and apprehend and reason through things with the help of this overflow, then you're able to have insight that other people aren't able to have, and that is prophecy. Different than the prophecy of Moses, according to Maimonides, because the prophecy of Moses came directly from God. God spoke to him directly, face to face, and it wasn't just this overflow from the active intellect. So that is what, as far as Maimonides is concerned, prophecy is for most people. So a prophet who has this in him can actually say things that will happen in the future. But according to Maimonides, in order for this to occur, you have to have very, very good character. And if you don't have excellent character, then you just won't be able to have this connectivity with the active intellect, etc. And one of the ways in which, according to Maimonides, you can tell if someone's a false prophet is looking at their behavior. This is all in the guide to the Perplexed. If you look at their behavior and you see, specifically with sexual impropriety, that they are people who are of immoral character from a sexual perspective, then these are people who cannot receive prophecy. So one of the ways in which you can figure out if they're real prophets or not is actually kind of look and see how they behave in a moral fashion. And if they behave in a moral fashion, then it's much more likely that they will be able to be prophets. So this kind of purity from a sexual perspective is really important for prophecy, according to Maimonides. Now, just a side note that I might mention here is that Maimonides kind of goes onto this tangent in which he says that there are some people who don't like the laws of the Torah. And the reason why they don't like the laws of the Torah, according to Maimonides, is because these are people who are immoral themselves. People who are immoral, people who don't have control over their faculties, people who want to be wild and do things which are immoral, etc. Those people won't like the laws of the Torah because they want to act in a immoral fashion, and therefore they're going to find the laws of the Torah to be overly oppressive to their desire to act in this immoral way. But a person who's moral, and a person who is pure, and a person who's godly, that person is going to love the laws of the Torah. Not only are they not going to find it to be oppressive, but they're going to enjoy following it, etc., etc. Now, it's really interesting because people who have found it very difficult to maintain a very religious life and have found that being in a very highly controlled religious environment is challenging for them, will tell you that this is a very, very judgmental kind of way of looking at it. Well, if you don't like our laws, that's because you're an immoral person. That's because you just don't know how to control yourself, and that's why you don't like our laws. And that seems and feels very, very judgmental. But be that as it may, that is the way Maimonides looks at it, and he basically says that the laws of the Torah, they are things which are really enjoyable and pleasurable for the person who's a moral human being trying to cleave to the divine. But somebody who isn't, and someone who has very, very deep moral flaws, that kind of person is going to hate the Torah and is going to find it oppressive. So that is how he views it. Anyway, that's just a side note that I thought I would just mention. But in summary, it seems that Maimonides is of the opinion that if you want to find out who is a false prophet, well, look at their behavior. And if you find that they're immoral, specifically sexually immoral, then you know that they are probably a false prophet and you should not listen to them. Interestingly, the Torah doesn't say exactly that. The Torah says that if they tell you to follow other gods, then you know that they're a false prophet. So Maimonides in the guide differs slightly from the Torah itself. Now, if you look in the Sefer Hayad, which is Maimonides' book on the code of Jewish law, he calls also the Mishnah Torah, then you find that he has another opinion. He does kind of go and talk about, in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, he does talk about the fact that a prophet has to be of very good character, but in the first passage of chapter 10. In Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, he says, therefore, if a person fitting for prophecy in the work of the Lord comes, and he does not intend to add or diminish from the Torah, but rather he serves God through the midst of the Torah, we don't tell him to split the sea for us, revive the dead, or the like, and then we will believe in you. Instead, we tell him, if you are a prophet, tell us what will happen in the future. He makes a statement, and we wait to see whether his prophecy comes to fruition or not. Should even a minute particular of his prophecy not materialize, he is surely a false prophet. If his entire prophecy materializes, we should consider him a true prophet. The upshot of that is that you can have somebody who seems to be very righteous. He seems to be the kind of person who follows the Lord. He doesn't have any sexual impropriety, and he seems to be a prophet. And he says something that's going to happen in the future, and that doesn't occur, and now you know that this person is a false prophet. So I would argue that there's actually two parts to this. There's part number one, which is if someone shows up and they seem to be a prophet, and they want to present prophecy. How do I know whether I should listen to him or not? Well, first of all, we see in the Torah itself, if they tell you to serve other gods, we know, no matter what, he's not a prophet. Maimonides adds to that in the Sefer Hayad, Torah, and he says, well, if they tell you to do something which is against the Torah, you know he's a false prophet. In the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide to Perplexed, he adds on, he says, well, if it's an immoral person, a person who doesn't behave in a way which is sexually moral, then you also know that the person's probably a false prophet. And there are famous stories, which I won't get into now, about people from other religions who are now sitting in jail. They were supposed to be the prophet, but if you actually looked into the way they behaved sexually, you knew that they were a false prophet. So that is a way in which you can find whether they're a false prophet. So all of that is related to, should I listen to him now? So in that moment, when the prophet is standing in front of me, and he is telling me to behave in a certain way, how do I know? Should I listen to you or not? Well, if all things being equal, if this prophet is somebody who is upright, telling me to follow God's ways, is a very moral person, his character is flawless, seems to be a person who serves God, then yes, that seems to be a prophet. The criteria is all there. At that moment, when the person is alive, standing there in front of us, he seems to be a very upright, religious person, seemingly a prophet. Therefore, I should follow that person. So that's in that moment. But over time, how do I know whether the person is a false prophet or not? Well, that is, if they say something, does it happen or not? So there's two parts to this. There's a time I'm going to want to know whether the prophet is a prophet at that moment, when the prophet is about to prophesy, when he's a religious leader. Then I'm going to know, is he a prophet or not? And then I have to look at his character and what he's saying. Does it fit in with the Torah? Is this person of good, moral, upstanding character or not? But then there's over time, do I know if the person's a prophet? So you're going to have to judge whether the person was a real prophet in hindsight. And for that, you want to know, the things which he said were going to happen, did they happen or not? And if they didn't happen, then you know the person's a false prophet. So if the person makes prophecies and it doesn't happen, then you know the person's a false prophet. Really interestingly, I was talking with a friend of mine about this, and I was talking about, people who say things that are going to happen in the future, even religious people, and they don't occur. Are they false prophets or not? And he said, well, technically, unless they said, Koyamar Hashem, so says the Lord of Israel, and then they give their prophecy, and then they wouldn't be considered false prophets. Based on what Maimonides is saying, both here in the Sefer Hayad, in his code, and in the Guide to Perplexed, I beg to differ. Because what is a prophet, according to Maimonides? A prophet is somebody who has both courage and divination. What's courage and divination? As we said, divination, that they have this ability somehow to see what's going to happen in the future. And then they have the courage of their conviction to say and tell people, this is what's going to happen. If you behave this way, then there's going to be bad things. They can see that clearly. Or they can see good things are going to happen in the future. And they say that clearly. And then the courage to speak truth to power because they see with great clarity. They are seers, as they're mentioned in the prophets. The prophets call them, they're seers. They're people who can see things in the future. And then they have the courage to speak truth to power based on that which they see. So a true prophet is somebody who has this overflow from the divine intellect, or the active intellect, into their imagination and into their own intellect, and then they're able to say things which are going to happen because, by definition, by the very nature of things, they happen. So if they say things and they don't occur, that's because they just don't have the intuition. They just don't have it. They thought they may have had it. We thought they may have had it, but they actually didn't have it. So they're false prophet by definition. They're false prophets. They don't have to, in order to be considered a false prophet, maybe in order to be able to be killed or to be chayav misa, to be culpable of the punishment of death for saying false prophecy, they've had to have actually have said false prophecy in the name of the Lord. But by definition of the fact that what they said didn't come to fruition, didn't unfold, didn't actually happen, that means they're a false prophet. Because true prophets can't ever say something which won't come to fruition, because they have the intuition. By definition, they have that clarity. They are the seers. So to recap, there is, at the time when the prophet is around and alive and talking, you want to know, should I follow this religious leader or not? And we often have that question. Because as I mentioned in the preamble to this, when you talk about religious leaders, it's very difficult to know whether are they really listening to God or not? Are they for real? Should I really follow them? And religious leaders often make very huge demands on their followers, especially in high demand religions. They will ask them to do things for them, which impact their own ability to have a life often. They will often have requests of their followers which takes away from the followers' own autonomy. And the reason why followers will follow that person is because they believe that person somehow is communicating with the divine. So it's very difficult to know, however, is this person for real or not? How do I know? Well, we have a way of knowing according to Maimonides. At the time when the person's prophesying, you need to see a few things. Number one, are they telling you to follow God, not another God? Not some other version of the divine. Number two, are they telling you to keep the Torah, the laws, which came through Moses? Or are they having their own take on it, changing it, adding to it, etc.? Number three, how are they behaving personally? Are they moral, upstanding people themselves in their personal lives? And if they have all these three things, and you see they're people who are serious in serving God properly, then they are capable of prophecy, and one should listen to them. We still don't know for sure that they're prophets. We just assume that they're prophets. But then over time, if things they said will happen don't actually occur, then you know they're false prophets. So predicting the future is very, very risky business for a prophet, according to Maimonides, because you don't want to be one of these people who are known as a false prophet. But it's really important for us as religious people to really judge prophets on these two levels. Number one, who are they in their character and what are they saying? Is it in line with tradition? Or is it out of line with tradition? Are they starting to say things which are new and different? Do they have a new take on things which seems to be kind of radically different than what went on before and what came from the Torah Moshe? Number one. Number two, over time, are the prophecies they've made, are the things that they said will happen, did they come to fruition or not? And if they didn't, even if they were great back in that time, and they seemed to be a legitimate prophet, we know in hindsight that they were a false prophet. It's really important to keep this in mind, that there's two time points in which one judges prophets or religious leaders. Number one, at the time that they're actually teaching, and then after they've taught and after they've spoken about the future, you judge them again to see whether they're true prophets or not. And I would argue that there are many, many leaders. I don't need to go into details or name names, but if we put these two criteria and these two tests to them, we will find that throughout our history, there have many, many, many people who would fit the criteria that Maimonides would see as false prophets, and we might want to take their statutes down, so to speak. I know this might be a little bit controversial, but I wanted to put this out there. I'm really interested and open to everyone's thoughts. If you want to name names in the comments, you can. Feel free to. This has been Levi Brackman with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.